Steve is with the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association Chamber of Commerce. He is a long-time strategic ally of our organization and our industry, and represents our states and our region's business interests. And so he is the perfect person to kind of give us a recap. He's also well-versed on many of the issues that we talk about related to commercial real estate, because many of them are very interconnected. But really, again, giving us an overview. Now that we have a state budget, what does that mean? Where do we go from here? What is all the hard work that's going to go into making that final document that really is our state budget? So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Steve, who's going to give us a little bit more of a background and then get us started. And I'll run the slideshow, so just let me know when you want it up.
All right, thanks, Tracy. Thanks everybody for giving a chunk of your day for this. It's always fun to do things with CARW. You guys, I hope you all and ladies, I can't see in the icons here, but I hope you all appreciate the team you've got working for you in Tracy and Alexis and Amanda. They just do amazing stuff, and they are such great partners for us at the MMAC. So when they ask for something, I am always happy to help. Because they are great partners, allies, and force multipliers for a lot of the work we do here at MMAC. As Tracy said, I'm the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs here at the MMAC. I do the political work, the policy work, the government work. I came to MMAC through kind of a circuitous career route. I went from TV, working in TV, to working in RVs, to working for TGT, to working for MMAC. And actually, in between TGT and MMAC, I worked with Jeff for a little more than a decade in the state legislature, in the speaker's office, but I couldn't make that rhyme. So if anybody's got a good way to work that into from TV, RV, TGT, MMAC, figure out something for that assembly time, and I will forever be in your debt, because that gets a real quick career builder. But so I've worked in and around public policy and government for quite a while, on both sides of the desks. When I came here to MMAC, I used to joke that I went from being the beggee to the beggar, because now I'm the one going to the legislature and begging for stuff in a budget, rather than sitting at the desk and hearing all of them come in with their wish lists. So the work I do here at the MMAC really boils down to a philosophy for our organization that fits the old adage in politics that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably going to end up on the menu. And it's my job for MMAC and its 1,600 member businesses to provide that seat at the table for them and their interests, and to make sure that they're represented. You know, they're all busy running lives and running businesses, and don't have the time to get involved and to be monitoring the sausage making of politics and policy in Madison and Washington. That's where I come in and where my team comes in. And so it brings us into a lot of different topics and a lot of different issues. And we're going to talk about the budget today, but I'm going to do so at kind of a 30,000 foot level. I hope that's okay for you, because budgets are very dense and complex. And also the issues we deal with at MMAC cover a really broad waterfront. So I want to do it at that 30,000 foot level, and just touch on some major themes, and then leaves a fair bit of time for dialogue and questions back and forth, because on something as big as what's happening in Madison in general, but the budget in particular, I could speak for the entire time and completely miss anything you care about. And so I want to leave that time so that things that you care about that I maybe didn't get in the overview, we can dig in a little deeper to. And, you know, just again, the waterfront of issues that MMAC engages in. Tracy talked to some of them that we've partnered with CARW over the years in, but it's everything from education to economic development, to transportation, you know, infrastructure, utilities, from COVID policy. Tracy and I have been spending a lot of time on COVID policy with the Department of Health this spring. Brewers, Bucks, the Convention Center, again, great partnership with the commercial realtors in getting all of those projects done. Tax policy, choice schools, charter schools, MPS governance. bird glass, which we're in the middle of right now, that Tracy has probably been talking to you about, dark stores, all of those things. It's just a broad waterfront of issues. And so my job is kind of playing the accordion, where I've got to be way out here on covering a bunch of issues, but also have the flexibility and the intellectual ability to focus down on smaller issues at the precise inflection point. So let's get into the state budget. And Tracy, you can bring up the slides right now. I just have a few slides here to kind of set the broader context of the budget. The state budget is a $41 billion budget, biennial budget. And when I say that, that's $41 billion in general purpose revenue. That's kind of your state and local taxes that fund the budget. Now, the budget's also made up of federal money and program revenue and fees and that. And in total, over the biennium, over the 2-year cycle, it's over $90 billion. But the state funding portion of it is in that $41 billion range. And so I just want to, when we break things down in our business, we talk about kind of sources of funds, uses of funds. And I think it's a good way to start looking at the overview of the budget. So you go to the next slide, Tracy. In this budget, the governor increases, I don't know, there's increases sources of funds, or there is an increase in sources of funds by about $3.8 billion. And this is where it comes from. The state starts the budget cycle with an opening balance of about $1.1 billion. There's a projected revenue growth over the next 2 years because tax revenues have been strong of about another $1 billion. And then there's a gross tax hike involved in this budget, or proposed in this budget, of $1.6 billion. So you look at the budget, you have a $41 billion budget, you have existing revenue sources. This is where the governor is going to build his new budget and his new initiatives. So he has $3.8 billion in new money coming in. How does he use that? If you flip to the next slide, Tracy, you'll see this. What he does is he breaks it down. $3.2 billion of that goes to new spending, new initiatives he's got that spend new state money. $600 million of it go to tax relief, tax cuts, some different things that he's done to lower the tax burden. Now you'll notice it's $600 million in tax cuts. He has about $1.6 billion in tax increases. So this budget has a net tax hike of over $1 billion. But this is kind of where he takes that money, that new money that's coming in, and he spends it. And to break down that spending a little further, I just have one final slide. And these items that you'll see on this next bar graph, these spending areas comprise almost 80% of the entire state budget, and the entire state general purpose revenue budget. Just these 7 areas: DPI and school aids, medical assistance, that's your Medicaid, that's your health assistance, corrections, UW, property tax credits, shared revenue, and tech colleges. And I show you this because a lot of times when we see that big picture of, wow, all this is going into spending, we think, well, let's just cut spending. It's not that easy because, again, these spending areas, medical assistant, very tough to touch because of federal requirements. School aids, very contentious to touch. Corrections, you can't just shut down the prisons. UW system, some of these things, that's where most of the spending in the budget is. Beyond these areas, there's only about 20% that's still discretionary in the budget. So I just wanted to do that as a little bit of a fiscal context. And Tracy, you can pull those down, and then we'll get into some of the specifics here. I mean, budgets, as all of you know, are plans. So this is the Tony Evers budget. What's his plan? And his plan really falls into, you can see his campaign plan, you can see his governance philosophy. It's all articulated in this budget. And you see his priorities here. And the priorities for the governor in this budget are, first, he does a Pledge of Allegiance to his liberal base. He has things in this budget that are obviously appealing and red meat to his political base, which any governor heading into an election cycle is going to be doing. His biggest emphasis, like you saw in that graph, is education. His funding increases in K-12 education, his funding increases for the UW. That's where this governor came from. That's what he understands best. And that's where his priority is always going to be. And so the bulk of discretionary funding in this budget, he has targeted toward education. The other two emphases that kind of tell the story of his plan and his priorities are equity and climate change. He puts a fair bit of new money into programs in those areas. Again, those are things that appeal to his base, but those are also things that he believes he can break ground on initiatives in and kind of be progressive and ahead of the curve politically on those things. Within his budget, I'm going to break down briefly into a few categories. We'll do the old Clint Eastwood movie, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In this budget, there's some really good stuff. Now, whether it gets through in the end is questionable, but I mean, the education funding, the UW funding is very positive from our perspective at MMAC. It's an investment that returns a pretty good dividend for us economically because it creates a talent base that we can grow an economy off of. Those are very good things. I-94 East-West, a project that Tracy has been a prime driver behind, no pun intended, and Jeff has been involved in for years, is enumerated in the governor's budget. That basically puts that highway improvement and reconstruction and expansion on the table and gets it moving in the governor's budget. And that's very good. The governor establishes a venture fund, which is something, venture capital is an area that the state of Wisconsin has traditionally lagged in, and the governor has some aspirational initiatives in that area, proposing $100 million to start creating a state venture fund to beef up our operation there. Some of the local revenue options in this budget are very important to us at MMAC. About a decade ago, we engaged in a number of studies with accounting members of our organization, and they gave us a strong message that, Wisconsin's revenue mix is messed up. Our overall revenue and tax burden is not terribly out of line with where it ought to be, but the way we do it and the way our revenue mix is put together with a strong reliance on income tax and property tax and a very small reliance on consumption taxes and sales taxes doesn't position us very well for economic growth. And so the governor actually in his budget provides some local revenue options via sales tax that the MMAC has worked with him on and is going to continue to work to refine. What we want to do is diversify the revenue options available, because in a city like Milwaukee, in a region like this that faces considerable fiscal challenges, if we don't give them additional tools to use to diversify their revenue streams, all of that burden is going to fall back on the property tax, which is about the only source, the primary source of local funding option for local governments. And property tax, as you know in your business, is in many ways the most debilitating tax to economic growth. Income tax runs a close second, but I would argue property tax is even more debilitating. And so we're looking for ways to diversify the revenue stream to take some of the pressure off the property tax. And then also in what I would say the good side of the ledger here from our 30,000 foot standpoint would be the broadband expansion that the governor has proposed. Broadband is an issue that, again, is a force multiplier within an economy. And so we're pleased to see him focusing on that. I think that's an area you'll probably see some consensus with the legislature on in working to find a solution to expand access to broadband throughout the state and to strengthen access. Sometimes we think in urban communities like ours, everybody has access to broadband, but they really don't. I mean, there's an economic segregation and a geographic segregation when it comes to broadband access. And the governor tries some things in this budget to address that problem. Now, that's in the good, bad, ugly. That would fall in my good bucket. On the bad side, you've got like I mentioned, you have $1 billion in tax hikes, and it's not only the fact that you have the tax hikes, but it's where the governor is proposing the biggest tax hikes. And the two biggest ones are trimming back the manufacturing and agriculture tax credit and trimming back the capital gains tax exemption. Both of those really penalize growth and really penalize investment. And those are the things that fuel our economy and are tools that we have used very effectively here at MMAC and in our economic development organization, the M7, to recruit and to market our region outside. You know, manufacturing is always going to be the fastball of our economy. The manufacturing agriculture tax credit, which basically makes manufacturing activities tax-free here in Wisconsin, has been a great tool to attract people in and to really, you know, accentuate the strength that we have as an economy regionally with our manufacturing tradition and our skilled manufacturing labor base. So we view those as pretty negative. The governor also caps enterprise zones. Enterprise zones are, again, another tool that's been used very effectively to encourage economic development, to recruit businesses in here. The governor caps the number of those available at the state level. He raises the tax on utilities. The governor has on your utility bills, you all know you pay a number of different taxes and charges. One of them is focus on energy. The governor proposes doubling that. That is going to have a very noticeable impact on utility bills. We think that that is, again, something that's a net negative for our economy. Another thing that he does in this budget that is of particular interest to us and concern to us at MMAC is he's capping educational options. As much as we appreciate him investing more money into education, things like special education, 4K, things like that, at the same time, he's proposing to cap educational options. He's eliminating one of the statewide charter school authorizers. He is capping enrollment in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. And, you know, we would argue that you can't suck on both ends of the straw when it comes to education. It's really nice if you put more money in, but if at the same time you're constraining people's access to quality options, you're really not addressing the talent problem, and you're really not empowering parents and children to have the brightest futures they can. So those are things that we would consider on the bad side. And the final one, which I know you're all very familiar with, is dark store. The governor tries to go back and do some of the things that we successfully blocked in the legislature with regard to property taxation of commercial property that has been, I think, misconstrued and really mischaracterized in a lot of ways over the past years as an unfair dark store tax exemption that businesses are getting over on. What the danger of what the governor's trying to do on dark store and what the legislature was trying to do is it creates a whole new class of taxation, of property taxation. It might well be unconstitutional, but it also takes us down a very dangerous road of saying, we're going to tax your property based on how you're using it, not on the value of your property. And so the governor proposes that in his budget. That's a concern to us, and that's another one in the bad bucket. And then in the ugly bucket of the good, bad, and the ugly, I would throw in some of that red meat to his political base, the repeal of right to work that he puts in this budget, that the reimposition of prevailing wage requirements, and the repeal of most of, not all, but most of the Act 10 collective bargaining reforms. And those things are obviously, like I characterized it initially, it's kind of the pledge of allegiance to the liberal base of his. And it's understandable that those things are in there because he kind of has to check that box with his constituency. But those would have a devastating effect on our competitiveness. And, you know, this is not just a business association, you know, parroting a conservative line or a Republican line on this. There are practical implications of rolling these things back. Right to work, prevailing wage, the reforms made in those over the past couple of years have again made a huge impact in our ability to compete for jobs and for economic development from outside the state and in some cases outside the country. And the rollback of Act 10, you know, Act 10, for all of the controversy it caused, it put Wisconsin's fiscal house in order in a way that really has set us up again competitively. Businesses are looking for stability. We have been very effectively poaching from the dumpster fire, which is the fiscal situation in our neighbor to the south, Illinois. You start repealing the reforms of Act 10 and you start slipping back to where our fiscal condition doesn't carry the same sort of stability that it does right now. And it puts us in a less competitive and less advantageous position in our competition again for jobs and economic development. So brief overview there of what the governor has proposed. I just want to touch quickly before answering questions on where does it go from here. You know, that's the governor's plan. Now the legislature gets to build its budget, and it will start with the Joint Committee on Finance, which will take the governor's budget, will largely start from scratch and build its own. Once the Finance Committee completes its work, it will pass its budget on to the various houses of the legislature to pass through the Assembly and the Senate, and then go to the governor's desk. So in a lot of ways, the governor is off the field now for the next 5 months with regard to the budget. He proposes it. Now the legislature gets to build theirs. The governor becomes practically relevant. Now, mind you, he still has the bully pulpit and there's a political relevance there, but he becomes practically relevant within the budget process again in late June or July, when the legislature puts a budget on his desk, and he can then exercise his veto authority to sign what he wants and veto what he wants. So that's the stage we're in now. The legislature will probably start their budget process by pulling out most of the non-fiscal policy in the budget. It's something that legislatures of both parties have done quite often. They take some of the policy, things like the right to work, the Act 10, probably even the marijuana legalization, Medicaid expansion, probably dark store, some of those things that are more policy items. They will pull those out and encourage them to be considered as separate legislation, not considered in the context of the budget. And then they will build a budget on their priorities. And right now, what I would suspect their priorities will be is to remove those tax increases, particularly the business tax increases. They will, because they're removing those tax increases, that takes some of the money off the table. I think you'll see an increase in education spending in the legislature's version of the budget, but it probably will be trimmed back a little bit from the governor's. And I think the governor kind of expected that. I mean, the governor's education budget was kind of everything you could think of and a pony. I mean, it is really a generous package. I think he understands that'll probably be trimmed back, but I think there's going to be some common ground in education they can reach on. And I think that in the transportation and capital projects area, the legislature, again, similarly will tweak what the governor has done and proposed in those areas, but not completely toss them out. There are a number of capital projects and transportation projects. I mentioned I-94 East-West. On the capital project side, we have, the Milwaukee Public Museum here. That's proposed to be funded in the governor's capital budget. Some of the state office building things and some of the UW things. Those, I think, are likely to stay in some form, though the legislature may trim back because they have to balance the budget. And at the end of the day, people ask me, well, we have divided government. Does that mean we'll have gridlock? Does that mean the legislature is going to, this is going to drag out into the fall? And my completely accurate, but completely weaselly answer is, I think this budget is actually going to be passed very early or very late. And what it comes down to is what the legislature and the governor want to fight on. There is a path to early passage. And I think that path is, again, stripping out policy, taking out the tax increases, and taking the money you have left, because our economy is growing and new money's coming in, and splitting that probably between the priorities of based kind of ranked in the priorities that you saw in that spending chart earlier. Education, UW, corrections, tech colleges, those sort of things. I think there's a number they can get to where the legislature will give it. This is kind of what happened 2 years ago, where the legislature put a budget bill on the governor's desk that was not as fat as what he had sent them, but it still included a lot of the thematic areas that he had in his budget, and he ended up signing it. Now, he was under a lot of pressure to veto it last time around, and this time, heading into an election year, he could well, if the governor if the legislature puts a budget that has substantial differences from his proposal on his desk, he could veto it to highlight where his positions are and where his issues are. Great example of that is, say the legislature would take that $17 billion in K-12 education and knock that down to $10 billion. Well, 2 years ago, that's essentially what happened. The numbers were a little bit different. And the governor said, you know what? 10 billion is better than nothing. And it's a pretty nice increase, or, you know, whatever the increase was 2 years ago. And he signed it into law. This year, heading into an election cycle, he could see a political advantage in saying, I'm going to hold a hard line at this higher amount to reinforce my image as the leader in education and the guy who cares about kids, and to set up that political contrast between the parties. So if the budget gets politicized like that and faces a veto like that, then I think you could see us dragging well into the fall, and you could have a very late budget. Here in Wisconsin, if you don't pass a budget on time, you just continue under the previous year's budget. It takes pressure off. It's not like the federal government where you risk a shutdown. But even within that less pressure packed environment, you know, some people say, well, let's just go under last year's budget and keep going under that. The problem is, once you get into September, October, you have local governments and school districts that have to set their budgets. And if they don't know what's coming in, they know some budget is going to pass eventually, but they don't know what it's going to be. They get really jumpy. And when all your local governments, and Jeff can attest to this, when your local governments and your school districts get jumpy, the legislature gets jumpy eventually, and then it all resolves. But that could take us well into the fall if we have a kind of a veto battle as we head into the budget. So I'm going to wrap up there. And I know that's been like drinking from a fire hose and has been very conceptual and very high level, but I'm happy to get more granular on any of those items or any other items that you have questions about. That work, Trace?
That's perfect. And thank you so much. You are certainly, you've been pounding the pavement, right? In Madison for a long time, even just to get to this point, and you're going to be there a lot more. So I had a lot of private messages here, but I'm going to take them in order. So we're going to first turn it over to Jeff Stone, and I know that I have 2 other questions that came in privately. So let's start there, Jeff. And if others have questions, either let me know that you want to ask them, or let me know if you want me to ask them. So Jeff, go ahead.
Great. First, thanks, Steve. I thought this overview of kind of where we are. One of the things that you mentioned was that the governor's proposal changes some of the manufacturing tax exemptions. What do you know how it goes about that?
Yeah, what the governor does is he goes class warfare with the manufacturing tax exemption. He caps it by income, and so it knocks out, as you saw in that initial slide, it knocks out billions of dollars. It's actually the tax hike. Let me find my exact tax hike on there. It's about a $500 million tax hike just in that manufacturing and ag tax hike. And what he does is he income limits it, and he cuts off your eligibility at a certain threshold. And I can, for some reason, like 300,000 in receipts sticks in my head, but don't hold me to that. But that's
Okay.
how he does it. He basically caps your eligibility at certain incomes.
So something like CARW, where we've got a big manufacturer that's coming and making this giant investment, there would that all of a sudden that would all be taxable.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to folks like us that, you know, are involved in new real estate development. You know, you mentioned kind of poaching businesses from Illinois, and we had this whole corridor from Milwaukee to Kenosha where we've got a lot of, you know, new development coming in. So if they're manufacturing based as opposed to just maybe being warehouse, that's going to be a big hit.
Yeah, no, you nailed that, Jeff, because I mean, it makes a good talking point to say, you know, we're going to limit this to the people who need it most. And, you know, makes a good talking point, but it doesn't make good economic development policy or tax policy, because you're right. I mean, be it Haribo or Foxconn or Nexus or Milwaukee Tool, or you name it, you know, you take that tool off the table and it makes it harder to convince them to invest here and to grow here. Even GE, which is, you know, expanding onto the west side of Milwaukee and consolidating in Waukesha County, even as it's cutting things, you know, nationwide, it takes an advantage of ours off the table. And again, no offense to the smaller businesses, and I talk about this a little bit with the venture fund as well. You know, venture fund is great, and venture capital is great, but you know, you have to have a lot of successful startups that you bat 100% with out of your venture fund before you even start to sniff the kind of job and economic development impact of one Nexus or one Haribo or one of these larger companies that we're able to attract and able to aggressively go after because of the manufacturing tax credit. So again, it's a good talking point. It's bad economic development policy.
So I'm kind of assuming that goes away right away. But then in addition, the other thing that you talked about was the sales tax idea. And I guess I'm curious, what do you think the odds are? Obviously, WMC, has come out against it already, and there was some other business groups, I think. But I know, I look at the burden that we have on property taxes, and I think it weighs down property values in our area. And I think it's something that we really have to look hard at and say, how can
this is another one that opposition is a good talking point. It gets a little messier when you get down into the reality. There are people who are teasing me about that proposal because they know MMAC has worked on it and has been an advocate for it, saying, well, I see you got two chances in this budget with that proposal, slim and fat. So it's going to be a heavy lift to get it through. But when you start digging into the realities and the fiscal realities, and like you said, kind of quantifying the cost of doing nothing on this, it starts to get ugly real fast. Because the city of Milwaukee is really strapped in its budget. You've seen law enforcement cuts in the past couple of years. The city's pension contribution is going to nearly triple for law enforcement in 2023. There is no light at the end of the tunnel right now fiscally for the city of Milwaukee, and in many ways for Milwaukee County, that isn't attached to a freight train that's about to run them over fiscally. And unless there is a situation where we can get the city or the county the authority to declare municipal bankruptcy, which I think is a really, it's a really dangerous idea, and it's really tough for them to ever get that authority because they do have revenue options. They can always go to the property tax and increase it via referendum. But to your point, then you're offloading onto a tax. And in Milwaukee, I believe 94% of the revenue generated here for the city of Milwaukee is generated by the property tax right now. You can't strap more on that. And so sales tax actually, in addition to diversifying the revenue stream, it can take pressure off that property tax. It can help with that fiscal situation and stave off just a full-blown fiscal crisis. And it also captures, in an area like this, it captures revenue from people out of state. We're the hub of tourism and travel here. And so it captures people. It's not all local residents paying for it. So, again, it's going to be difficult to get it through. I think we may see the legislature more quickly discard this as a statewide solution. And we may retrench back to just having them look at this as Milwaukee only. And can we do this as a pilot in Milwaukee? Because Milwaukee has some unique challenges fiscally and is a unique area in terms of revenue base and the revenue it can generate with a sales tax. But our job, as my boss, Tim Sheehy, often says, he reminds me that my job is to make the politically impossible, the politically inevitable. And so we're going to keep working on it. And, we've, Tracy's been there as we've got things that have been declared dead, resurrected and passed. People were mocking both of us on the radio, 4 or 5 years ago when we were going after a new arena for the Bucks. We were all told we were crazy, and that political impossibility became politically inevitable. Same thing on a number of issues. So we're going to do that with the sales tax. Again, it's easy to be against it as a talking point. It's tougher if you actually start getting into the dollars and cents.
Thanks, Steve.
Well, and even when you talk about, what are the other revenue sources? This was a question that came up about raising revenue just in general, or, do we have to cut in terms of the budget? So what do you?
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I put that spending chart up there, because you can cut in the budget, but then you have to ask, where are you going to cut? And that's one of the complexities of, Jeff, you said you assume that the legislature will pull out the manufacturing and ag, tax hike, and I think they will too. But you well know, because you were sitting in that chair, all of a sudden you blew a $500 million hole in your budget, and you got to find that money somewhere, because in Wisconsin the budget has to be balanced. And so you can cut your way, but two things to keep in mind. One, you look at those programs that I listed, those top 7 programs that are about 80% of state discretionary funding. I mean, it's pretty tough to start cutting in there. Beyond those programs, there's not a whole lot of money out there. So if you're having to come up with $1 billion, say, to get rid of the tax increases, all right, where are you going to take it from? You're going to take it from K-12 education? You're going to take it out of school aids? You're going to take it out of shared revenue? You're going to close a prison? And so again, it's one of those things that it's an easy talking point, and it's a legitimate talking point, because government should have to show fiscal discipline and should have to justify its spending. But the reality of the budget and how the budget is constructed is that a lot of those things, either actually or practically, the biggest money drivers and the biggest pots for savings are off the table. We can't get out of medical assistance. We can't stop funding schools. We could cut shared revenue, but we've been flat on shared revenue for over a decade now. So when you get to those big honey pots of money, when you talk about, let's eliminate taxes and just spend more or spend less, it gets dicey, because the policy implications of those cuts start to hit home really quickly, and start to hit home in a way that is politically dicey, both for the governor and for the legislature. So you will see the legislature do some cutting. I mean, this budget, like the last one, is very generous. And I think one of the reasons it's as generous, over the last 2 budgets, the governor has basically increased spending by 20%, has proposed to increase spending by 20%. And if you're a Democrat governor with a Republican legislature, you do that. I mean, you're crazy not to, because you get to be the person saying yes, and you make the legislature be the people saying no, reeling it back in. And that's kind of the dance we're in here. And I think you'll see that. You'll see spending, a combination of spending cuts and elimination of tax hike as the budget moves forward.
Well, kind of on that note, we talked earlier kind of in our pre-call about the capital budget, which was just released yesterday. Can you, and maybe this is more of an education for some of us, how are the governor's budget and the capital budget related, and how do they work in concert or against one another? Because as an example, transportation funding and the I-94 discussion, that's going to be discussed in the governor's budget, but also transportation is addressed in the capital budget. How can you kind of talk through that with us?
Yeah, here's the, I don't know if it's easy way to look at it, but I mean, you have different sources of money. And you have general purpose revenues, that's sales tax, income tax. That's most of what we've been talking about here. Then you have segregated funds and program funds. Those are things that are raised by a specific source for a specific purpose. That's what funds your transportation fund. The gas tax, the registration fee puts money in the transportation fund, combined with program revenue from the federal government and other program revenue, inspection fees and that sort of thing. Those fund the transportation budget. And that pot is what your road projects, your I-94 east-west, your southeast mega projects, that's out of that pot, not out of the general purpose pot. The capital budget is basically the state's, in a way, it's the state's credit card. It's kind of its long-term borrowing. And so the capital budget is borrowing. That's the easiest way to look at it. And so it's the state authorizing, we are going to authorize bonding for these purposes. And so, for instance, the governor's budget, or the capital budget he introduced yesterday, has everything from a $165 million state office building in downtown Milwaukee to tossing in $40 million toward the $250 million renovation or construction of a new Milwaukee Public Museum. And it goes all the way to new dorms at the UW, to little things. Jeff, you probably remember the gazebos and welcome centers that people get in their districts as little capital project work. And so what it does is it basically is state-backed borrowing to put money into these long-term capital projects. And the philosophy is the same thing as any of your capital budgets. Is there are some things that are long-term assets that we will borrow for and add to our debt service and pay for through that, because these are assets that are going to be in place for many years. State office building. We pay $165 million to build a new state office building here in Milwaukee. That thing's going to be around for another 40, 50 years. So it makes sense to borrow for that. Now, whether it's actually going to get done in this budget is a whole different, thing. State employees are not the most sympathetic audience right now. And there are people who might want to spend that money on something else in their district or for some other project. But does that help? I mean, you have different pots. You have general purpose revenue, and that's what we're funding school aids and corrections and things like that out of. You have transportation fund, which is program and segregated stuff that's raised for a specific fund, goes there and can only be used for a specific purpose. And then you have the capital budget, which is state borrowing.
Wow. So we have lots of things that we're going to kind of work through. I want to close it up with kind of a call to action. As a business community, as a commercial real estate community, we're very interconnected. Any high level takeaways or action items that you recommend we do, or any specific issues that we should really be paying attention to, because they could, happen quickly or could not happen if we don't pay attention to them?
I think and some of this is my bias because it's agenda stuff here, but this governor is very, one of his strengths, I think, in terms of his messaging, is he always talks about connecting the dots. And I think for an association like yours, what you need to do for the legislature now, more than for the governor, because again, the budget is largely out of the governor's hand, so you need to help them connect the dots on some of these things and move them beyond talking points to reality. And what I mean by that is you need to contact your legislators and let them know, hey, you got to get rid of that manufacturing tax hike, because this is what it means for our business and for our industry. And things like, right to work, those sort of things. Talk about how they impact you, because a lot of these things, and it's the nature of media and it's the nature of politics, get boiled down into talking points. And, I'm for the sales tax or against the sales tax. And we're not, explaining, well, this is what happens if you don't do this. This is what happens if you do that. So, I mean, I think on things like the manufacturing tax credit, I think on things like enterprise zones, I think you need to be in contact with your elected officials, and you need to let them know how it really impacts you. And, all the way down to, I know some of you have a great passion in the education area. One of our biggest challenge, if not the biggest challenge, one of our biggest challenges here in the region is having enough skilled labor to fuel our economy. And you guys desperately rely on a growing economy because you need something to fill those commercial buildings. But you can't cap educational opportunity in a city whose public school district is second only to Detroit in terms of worst school districts in America, in terms of academic performance and in terms of racial achievement gap. You cannot be capping educational options for parents and students and expect that we're going to have a pipeline of talent that can fuel the growing economy. And so when you contact people about an issue like that, connect the dots for them of, look, I'm not, it's not that I hate MPS. It's not that I'm a shill for, University High School or some choice or charter school. I'm looking at it as a businessman or woman. I'm looking at it practically, and we can't have an education pipeline that has as many leaks in it right now. And you cannot shut down options and shut down life rafts that are providing the future talent that's going to fuel this economy, a way to get off the sidelines and into action. So again, it's a little bit of a esoteric answer, but what I would say is on any of the issues you see in this budget, or any issues that Tracy highlights for you in this budget, as you're connecting with legislators, and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, because you were there, connect the dots for them. That it's not just a talking point, it has a real economic ramification on you and your ability. Because a lot of people see commercial real estate, right to work doesn't matter on that. Well, it does if we can't attract a company in here, because I see Rebecca from M7 is on this. I mean, she knows that we won't even get a sniff from some companies if we're not a right to work state. Well, you repeal that, all of a sudden it takes us off the field on an entire category of job recruitment, which takes those jobs and that real estate out of the game for you guys. So connect the dots on whatever issue you're engaging.
And it does mean a lot when it comes from somebody, like you said, directly from a constituent. If you're talking to your representative, it helps to have the group talking about it, but also have somebody that lives in your district reinforcing that. So.
Well, and I think that's a great place to close. A couple quick announcements. Speaking to our legislators, our government day is on April 14th. So this is going to be a virtual government day. So we won't have the drive to Madison. So we're coordinating all those meetings with the legislators virtually. Also on Friday, we have our policy committee call. We have Senator Devin Lemieux joining us. So he'll give us some insights in his new role as the Senate Majority Leader. So please, if you are not part of that committee and you're interested in joining us, again, it's at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock on Friday morning, let me know. Again, Steve, thank you so much for everything. And this was just such a high level overview. I know day in and day out, you're a tremendous resource for our organization, for our industry, and for our city. So thank you.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Have a good day, everyone.